Of the Greek city-states, we're going to look in depth at Athens and Sparta. We tend to look at Athens and Sparta because they were the largest of the Greek city-states and they were very different. So they're a good dual case study. So let's start with Sparta. You can see that Sparta was located slightly inland. They are in southern Greece as opposed to Athens, which is slightly farther north, and Athens is a little bit more coastal in nature. They were founded by the descendants of the Dorian invaders. Remember that the Dorian invaders were the people who conquered the Mycenaeans. We talked about that in the previous video. So the Spartans are going to rise to prominence after the end of those dark ages. They also invaded neighboring city-states and started to enslave people, which increased their population. The Spartan slaves were called helots. We'll talk about those a little bit more in a future slide. And one of the most primary defining characteristics of Sparta was that they were a military society. One of the reasons why they did this was because their slaves actually outnumbered their free population, and so they needed to have this militaristic society to try to keep this underclass in control. And we'll talk about that evolution in a little bit. So again, it's a militaristic society. So basically from birth, military is the entire way of life. If your baby was not healthy, they did not live. And you can use your imagination as to how far that worked. Boys that were as young as 7, think about that, that's first grade or maybe second grade. They started their military training and they were subject to a very harsh existence. They would sometimes be deprived food, they would suffer physical and mental abuse. They were ridiculed for showing any signs of weakness, and the idea was to train them to be killers, right? So it's similar to if you know anyone who's in the Marines, they're trained to be killers. They're trained to sort of remove the humanity of their enemies. They also trained and stayed in the military until they were 60 years old. So they either remained active in the military or at the very least they were in the military reserve, which means that if Sparta went to war, these people would be called upon to fight, which is an incredibly long time for military service. Even in the United States, people don't serve in the military until that long. So really, it was a way of life, not only for men, for that matter, but we'll talk about women now. So Spartan women are also mainly meant to help really ameliorate that militaristic society. So even if they were not directly fighting for Sparta, they were meant to be raising healthy and strong Spartan men. And they too were meant to be healthy and strong because the idea was that they would then make healthy, strong Spartan soldier babies, right? So Spartan women, first off, had a lot of autonomy. We'll contrast them with Athenian women. They actually tended to have more power because Spartan men were often away serving in the military, so Spartan women were more free to run their households. They sometimes received an education. This was more rare for Greek women. Spartan women could also own property, and they were not always secluded in their homes. Because a lot of times the men were away at war, Spartan women were sometimes expected to leave the home, do the shopping, so they could go out in public without a male accompaniment, and that was actually fairly rare in the Greek city-states. So one of the major reasons why Spartan women had more power was just because men were not around as much. Another thing that's really important is that Spartan women were meant to raise their children to be the most productive Spartan citizens as possible. So they were first educated, Spartan women that is, so that they could in turn educate their sons, right? They also were taught the values of the state religion, and they also were meant to revere the ancient kings who served as supreme priests. So the idea was that Spartan women were not meant to be deprived of an education because they had to train their children to be worthy Spartan citizens. As I said earlier, Spartan slaves were very common. They were called helots. They tended to be prisoners of war or captives that were freed or not freed rather. They were captives that would come from Spartan raids on their neighbors. Because there were so many slaves, it freed up Spartan men to serve in the military, and it also freed up women to focus on child rearing and also, of course, helping prepare their sons to be worthy soldiers. The Spartan slaves were not treated particularly well. That was partially to keep them in line. And also, again, as we were saying, there were more slaves than there were citizens in Sparta, so Sparta developed that militaristic society partially to keep those helots under control. So Sparta's government, it was an oligarchy. We talked about all the different government structures in the first video, so check that out if you forget. This meant that only a few people were in power. This is seen as a top-down approach. And part of the reason why the oligarchy was popular was because it was meant to keep the helots under control. This oligarchy was, first, we had 2 kings that ruled Sparta, but they were more symbolic in nature. They didn't really have any direct power. Instead, they had military power, so they led the army in times of war, and they were basically priests, so they led religious services. But other than that, the kings were really more symbolic in nature. Think about the monarchy in modern-day England, for example. It's more of a celebrity status than it really is a governing body. So there was an assembly and council of elders. They were really the lawmakers in Sparta. So this assembly, it was a group of male citizens over the age of 30, and then the council of elders basically acted as the Supreme Court in Sparta. They proposed laws to the assembly. These men were all over the age of 60. There were 28 of them. They made decisions. What's interesting about the Council of Elders was they would shout their decisions in the room. And whoever was the loudest basically got what they wanted. So again, think about that militaristic and kind of aggressive nature of Sparta. It's all too fitting that they actually had shouting competitions to make policy. What else? Their ideas were meant to really be internal. Sparta discouraged the exchange of ideas from other city-states. They were very afraid of change. And so in the Council of Elders and in the assembly, they highly discouraged bringing in any sort of ideas from other city-states or outside of the Greek city-states in general. Again, the Spartans saw this oligarchy, this top-down approach, as necessary to keep the society stable and to keep it prosperous. Okay, Athens now. So Athens, since we already talked about, again, how Sparta was seen as such a militaristic society, Athens, on the other hand, was seen as a much more intellectual society, a more educated society, and also a society that really defined government in generations to come. It was the influence to the Roman Republic, and of course it helped influence more modern democracies as well. The Athenians also came from descendants of Mycenaeans. Athens takes its name after the goddess Athena. Again, they were known for their political developments and intellectualism. So, the Athenians were not always a democracy. It's important for us to realize that. The earliest governments in Athens were monarchies, and there was also a period of aristocracy that followed that. And then as time goes on, we start to see more of a codification of Athenian law, and then eventually democracy evolves. So let's talk about some of the rulers and intellectual thinkers that started to shape the political structure that we know of when we think of Athens. First, we have Draco. So Draco, he was around in the 7th century BCE, and he is known for writing down what we see as the first Athenian constitution. So basically it was a code of law. We've seen this before. We could talk about period 1 with people like Hammurabi. So he's not the first person ever in history to write down laws with punishments. We can actually compare him to Hammurabi because just like him, he had very harsh punishments that were associated with breaking those laws. Another really important thing about Draco was that these laws were written down. There were codes of conduct that existed in Greek city-states before this, but it was difficult to really enforce them consistently and to know what they were. And so by writing them down, it's going to be much easier to enforce. We also get a major important vocabulary word from Draco. You may hear people sometimes refer to the word draconian. It's normally seen as a bad thing. To be draconian is to be very strict and harsh. Okay, so think about Draco writing down the rules and enforcing them heavily. So just like Hammurabi, he is a harsh guy, was in favor of punishing people, but at the same time is credited with starting to define Athenian democracy because he's writing down the rules. Then we have Solon. Okay, so he comes after Draco in the 6th century BCE. He is important in many ways. We see him as sort of extending or maybe laying the foundations for Athenian democracy, partially because he was very much in favor of creating some more equality in terms of land ownership. And he also wanted to level the economic playing field. So he actually improved Athenian life significantly because there were some Athenians who were enslaved for being in debt, and he stopped that. He freed those people who were imprisoned or enslaved for debt, and then he also placed limits on how much land any one person could own. And he also allowed all citizens to participate in government. So again, he is seen as less strict than somebody like Draco, and one of the people who sort of lays the foundations for that more equal political system of the Athenian democracy. And then we move on to a period of tyrants. Again, video 1 in this series talked about what tyrants are in general, so refer back to that if you forget. So basically, the reason why the tyrants emerged is because the the social structure of Athens became more complex with time. The merchant class grew in size because, as we remember again from video 1, the Greek city-states were largely trade-based. So the merchants become very powerful economically, but they don't gain political power along with that. So as the merchants start to gain much more of an economic status, they really start to resent the aristocrats because the aristocrats have all the political power and they're not willing to give the merchants more of a voice in government. So eventually the merchants decide that they want to join the small farmers who also don't have political rights and support tyrants to come to power. So basically, again, what tyrants are they were leaders who seize power with the people's support. So we could see it as, kind of these popular people that are in some ways reacting against that more traditional political structure of an oligarchy or a monarchy. Tyrants originally were very popular. Again, I like to think of Julius Caesar as a good example of a tyrant, even though he was Roman. So they were popular at first. It was seen as a way of kind of going against that more traditional system of rule with monarchs and oligarchs who oftentimes inherited their power. But we do see that later tyrants were going to be seen as harsher. So some of the early tyrants, they were popular because they did things like lower taxes. They again helped end the practice of enslaving people who could not pay their debts. They gave citizens a greater voice in power, but over time, the tyrants started to become a little bit more abusive. This man here was Pisistratus. He was a tyrant who lived in 546 BCE. He was seen as a popular tyrant. He divided large estates among landless farmers, and he helped the poor by loaning them money, and he gave them public works jobs. So a good example of a positive tyrant. All right, so how does Athenian democracy evolve? So the tyrant period was fairly brief, about 200 years long or so. And then, by the 500s BCE, we see that most of the Greek city-states overthrew their tyrants because they became more abusive. And we see that Athens evolves into a democracy, which again is one of the more solid foundations of our more modern government. So some city-states, Athens was the exception here, some city-states returned to aristocracies or monarchies, but Athens turned to a democracy. So in the earliest stages of Athenian democracy, it was what we call a direct democracy. So it was as pure of a democracy as we can think of. That meant that every citizen could vote directly on issues, right? So obviously this meant that you had to sort of have a smaller population to do this. It was very difficult to organize the entire population together to vote on an issue if it was too big. So what we do see is that over time, as the population of Athens grows, they evolve into what's called a representative democracy, which is really the kind of democracy that we have. And what this means is that instead of voting directly on issues, you would elect somebody to represent you, and then they would vote on the issues that you wanted. Okay, so we also sometimes call a representative democracy a republic, which is what evolves in Rome. So, the democratic Athenian government was comprised of 9 top officials. They were called archons. It was a council of nobles and a citizen assembly. And again, as we discussed earlier, not all Greeks were citizens. If you were born outside of Greece, if you were a slave, or if you were a woman, you were not considered part of the population. So it's important for us to realize that it's not a pure democracy in the modern sense of the word. All right, so who are some of the leaders that helped shape the Athenian democracy? One of the most important leaders in the earliest stages of Athenian democracy was Pericles. He ruled from 461 to 429 BCE, which is often referred to as the Golden Age of Athens. Athens very much had recovered from the Dark Age period at this point. And it's also seen as the Golden Age because it was prosperous economically. There are major artistic contributions, like the Parthenon is rebuilt, for example. It was previously destroyed by a war with Persia. Pericles was responsible for rebuilding it. So the Parthenon is a great example of wealth and culture. Pericles also is credited with many reforms to government. He transferred power to a larger assembly. Okay, so he created what was called the Council of 500. And this was basically an ongoing assembly that served as the government of Athens. So you could think of this as something like our Congress today, right? It is a representative assembly. So the people elected the members of the assembly, and then they would debate and vote on issues. Pericles also developed the people's courts, and what they did was they ruled on charges of legal violations. So they literally functioned sort of as like a criminal court. So this is an important extension of democracy, which we credit towards Pericles. So Athenian women. We talked previously in this video about how Spartan women were pretty powerful because men were always away at war, so women sort of had to pick up the slack. Athenian women, by contrast, were not as free as Spartan women. Again, because Athens is not as militaristic of a culture, Athenian men were not away as often. So first off, Athenian women were not able to participate in the government. They could not vote. They could not own any personal property. They could own personal items, but that was it. They were not educated. The idea was that men could be home to educate their sons to be future citizens, so women were not needed to do that. If women went into the public, so for example, if they went to court, for example, they needed to employ a male guardian to accompany them. So that's important because we already know that Spartan women were pretty free to go out of their houses without having to have a man accompany them. So that's a huge difference. Also, if a woman married early, which she tended to do, women could marry as young as 13 in Athens. They were largely excluded and isolated from public life. So women very rarely left their houses, even with a male accompaniment, after they got married. And again, one of the reasons why this is because we know that Athens, like other Greek city-states, was a patriarchal society, and they believed that women were intellectually inferior to men, and therefore they could not be satisfying relationship partners, and they were just not deserving of the kind of education that men received. They just didn't need it. It was pointless. All right, so that is a brief overview of Athens and Sparta. It's important to get those two down so that you can provide points of contrast, but also see the similarities where they fit. What we will talk about in a future video in this series is that Athens and Sparta are eventually going to come into conflict with one another, which is a very important part of Greek history. In the future video, we will talk about philosophy, thought, and Greek culture. So stay tuned for that one, and thanks for watching.